It was the third week of a killing drought in the Texas Hill Country, 106 degrees in the shade and no shade to be had. The day a starving Marine and his dog came up the dirt drive to Opal Greer's door. Wyatt Boone had run all the way to the end of his road and had nothing left in the world but the gaunt dog walking beside him. A German shepherd named Sarge, whose ribs showed now the same as his master's, who had not left Wyatt's side through 3 years of a man coming slowly apart. They had been walking the county roads for water and for work and finding little of either. And when Wyatt knocked on the screen door of the small white house at the end of the lane, he was braced for the thing he always got, the latch thrown, the hard look, the word, move along. Instead, an old woman of 88 looked through the screen at the burned, hollow-cheeked man and his suffering dog, and she did not reach for the latch. She leaned close to the mesh, and she whispered 4 words. What Opal Greer whispered on that porch in the heat would change the whole rest of Wyatt Boone's life. And before the summer was out, the broken Marine and the old widow would save each other from things neither one could have faced alone. Stay with me to the end of this one, and if you're new to this channel, go ahead and subscribe now, because this is the kind of story we tell, and you'll want to be here for what comes next. To understand a man who flinched at a screen door, you have to understand how far Wyatt Boone had fallen, and how quietly it had happened. He had been a good Marine, a dog handler, steady and trusted, and he had come home from his last deployment the way a lot of them do, to a marriage that had ended while he was gone without anyone quite saying so, to a daughter who looked at him like a visitor, to a country that had moved on to other things. There had been no single catastrophe. That was almost the worst of it. There had just been a slow leak, a job that didn't fit, then no job, a friend's couch, then a motel, then the truck, the savings gone, then the truck gone. Until one morning he had simply been a man walking a road with a pack on his back, not entirely sure how he had gotten there. He did not drink the way his own father had, but he understood now how a man could. He had stopped calling himself a Marine somewhere along the way because the word had started to feel like a thing he had stolen. The one decision he had never once wavered on, the only thing he had refused to let go of when he let go of everything else, was the dog. Sarge had been Wyatt's military working dog, and Wyatt had fought the paperwork and called in every favor he had left to keep him when they both came home. Through all of it, the couch and the motel and the truck and the road, the dog had stayed, sleeping against Wyatt's back in the cold and panting at his side in the heat, sharing whatever food there was and asking for nothing. And Wyatt had come to understand, in the long, empty hours of walking, that he was almost certainly still alive only because something depended on him being alive. A man can give up on himself with terrible ease. It is much harder to give up when there is a creature beside you who has decided you are worth following to the end. Have you ever watched a good person slowly disappear after they came home from something hard, a veteran, a widow, a neighbor who used to be so full of life, and wished you'd done more before they vanished? Tell me about them in the comments below. I read every one. The ones who slip away quietly are exactly who this channel is for. The woman behind the screen was Opal Greer, and she was 88, and she had not been afraid of a broken man on her porch because she had spent 50 years loving one. Her husband, Frank, had been a Marine in Korea, a rifleman who came back from a frozen reservoir with all his fingers and almost none of his sleep, and Opal had married him in 1955 and learned, slowly and without any manual to guide her, how to love a man who would never fully come home. Frank had been a good man and a hard one, kind on the surface and locked tight underneath, prone to long silences and sudden dark spells, a man who would sit on this same porch at 3 in the morning, watching a tree line that was 4,000 miles and 40 years away. They had never had children. It hadn't happened and they had stopped talking about why. So it had been the two of them, Opal and her haunted Marine, in this little house on the lane for half a century, until Frank's heart gave out one ordinary Tuesday and left her alone with a silence even louder than his had been. She kept his folded flag on the mantel. She kept his medals in a cedar box. And she kept, most painfully of all, a thing she had never said to him and now never could, a regret she carried the way Frank had carried his war, which was why, when she saw another ruined Marine standing where her husband used to stand, she did not see a beggar or a danger. She opened the door wider. She fed them first, because she was of the generation that feeds people before it asks them anything. a plate for the man and a bowl for the dog, and a tall glass of tea with the ice cracking against the side, and she watched the starving Marine try and fail to eat slowly. And she watched the dog look up at his master for permission before he touched the bowl, and something in the old woman's face moved at that, at a starving animal with manners better than most men. And when Wyatt finally found enough voice to start the apology he always gave, the explanation, the "I don't want to be any trouble," Opal Greer reached across the table and put her papery hand over his scarred one and stopped him. "Lean close," she told him. And when he did, she whispered the 4 words she had whispered at the door, the words that had stopped him cold on the porch and that he would turn over in his mind for the rest of his life. "I married one of you. That was all. I married one of you. Not a beggar, not a stranger, not a thing to be afraid of. One of you, a Marine who came home, carrying what you carry, a man I loved for 50 years and knew down to the bone. It is a strange and powerful thing to be seen all the way through by someone who has no reason to bother." Wyatt Boone had spent 3 years becoming invisible, had taught himself to expect the closed door, and an 88-year-old woman had looked through a screen and known exactly what he was, and opened the door anyway. He stayed for supper. He meant to leave after. He slept that night in Frank Greer's old workshop out back, on a cot Opal made up without being asked, with the dog across his feet, and for the first night and longer than he could remember, he slept the whole way through. He meant to move on in the morning. He stayed to fix the porch step that had nearly given under him, because a man should pay for a meal. Then he stayed to look at the swamp cooler that had quit in the worst week of the heat. The dog stayed too, and the dog, it turned out, had decided something about Opal Greer in the first hour. Sarge took to lying across the threshold of her kitchen while she cooked, and to walking the old woman out to her mailbox in the brutal noon as though the quarter-mile of dirt lane were a patrol he had assigned himself. And one afternoon, Wyatt came around the house and found the gaunt war dog with his big head laid in Opal's lap on the porch glider, the old woman's hand moving slow over his ears. The two of them not making a sound, 2 creatures who had each spent a long time waiting on a man to come back. Wyatt stayed, after that, because Opal Greer, he was beginning to see, was in trouble far worse than a broken step, and was far too proud to say so. It came out in pieces the way shame always does. There was a man named Lyle Beckett who had come around in the spring, smooth and friendly, in a clean truck with a magnetic sign on the door. And he had told Opal that her roof was failing and her foundation was cracking, and that a woman living alone couldn't be too careful, and he had a way of making concern sound like a threat. He had taken a deposit, then he had found more that needed doing, and taken more. The work, what little of it there was shoddy or invisible. And when Opal's money in the bank ran thin, Beckett had not gone away. He had started talking about a lien, about papers she'd signed that she didn't fully understand, about how these things could go very badly for an old woman who didn't cooperate. And he kept coming back every couple of weeks to collect against a debt that seemed to grow each time he explained it. Wyatt found the evidence of it everywhere once he knew to look. The contracts thick with language designed to confuse, the bank statements bled white, the repairs that had never happened behind the receipts that said they had. He saw the lie and the truth at the same time, the way he'd been trained to read a thing, and he kept his voice easy and said nothing yet. The way you don't spook the situation before you understand the ground. If a starving stranger and his dog turned up at your door in a heat wave, half dead and asking for nothing, would you have opened it the way Opal did? Or would you have told yourself it wasn't safe and let them move along? Be honest with yourself. Type open or closed in the comments below. I read every one. What hardened it for Wyatt, what turned a quiet anger into something colder and steadier, was the cedar box. He noticed, sitting with Opal one evening, that the box on the mantel where she kept Frank's medals sat open and empty, and when he asked, the old woman would not meet his eyes. Beckett had taken them. He had seen the medals when he was inspecting, and on a visit when the cash had run out, he had told Opal that a Korea Bronze Star and a Purple Heart had collector value, and that he'd take them against what's owed. And the proud old woman, frightened and alone and ashamed, had let a con man walk out of her house with the only things her husband had ever earned that the world could see. She had loved a Marine for 50 years and lost him, and then a smiling stranger had taken even that, and she had been too humiliated to tell a soul. Until a broken Marine who knew exactly what those medals meant sat at her table and asked her one gentle question. Wyatt also learned, in those long hill country evenings on the porch, the rest of who Frank Greer had been, and it changed something in him too. Opal told him about the dark spells and the silences and the 3 in the morning watches, and about how she had spent 50 years trying to reach a man who never quite believed he had made it back, who sat in his own kitchen for half a century still half convinced he had died on that frozen ridge with his friends, and that everything after was borrowed. The thing she had never said to him, the regret she carried, was that she had let him believe it. She had loved him quietly and well, but she had never once made him say the dark thing out loud, never forced the door, and he had died still locked inside it, and she would give anything she had left to go back and tell him the one truth she had finally understood too late. Wyatt Boone listened to all of it and understood that he was looking straight down the road at his own future, a man who came home in body and stayed lost in every other way, and understood, too, that the old woman across from him was offering him, without saying so, the chance she never got to give her husband. The reckoning came on a Thursday, and it came the way these things do. The smiling man walked up the drive on his own. Lyle Beckett arrived in his clean truck mid-morning to collect, and he came up onto the porch already talking easy and warm until he registered that the porch step was fixed and there was a lean, hard-eyed man standing in the doorway he had not expected. He recovered fast, the way his kind do. He had papers, he said. This was a legitimate business arrangement, and Mrs. Greer owed a balance, and it was really none of this fellow's concern, and he didn't want any trouble. By then there were others in the yard. A neighbor named Glenda from Opal's church, who had come by with okra and stayed when she saw the truck, and Deputy Wendell Boyd, whom Wyatt had quietly called the night before, and from the doorway, in a voice gone thin but suddenly steady, the old woman spoke, looking the con man dead in the eye for the first time. He took Frank's medals for the debt. No one moved. Even the dog did not move. It hung in the hot, still air, and everyone on that porch understood it at once, that this smiling man in his clean truck had taken a dead Marine's bronze star and purple heart out of a widow's hands as payment on a debt he had invented. Beckett opened his mouth to explain, to reframe, to make it sound like a fair transaction between consenting adults, and that was when Sarge rose. The dog came up off the porch boards and put himself between Beckett and Opal, and a low, unbroken sound came out of him. Not a bark, a decision, and Beckett took a step back off the top stair. The dog did not follow. He did not need to. He simply held the line, gaunt ribs and all, the way he had been trained to hold a line, and he did not take his eyes off the man. Then Wyatt Boone spoke, and his voice was low and level, the voice of a man who had stood in places where panic killed people. He did not shout, and he did not lay a hand on anyone. He laid it out plainly. In front of the deputy and the neighbor, the contracts built to confuse, the deposits taken for work never done, the bank account bled dry, the invented lien, the pattern that Deputy Boyd's own records would show ran through half the elderly folks in the county. And then he said the last of it quietly, the part that mattered most to him as a Marine, which was that the man had taken Frank Greer's medals, and that those were coming back today, and that Lyle Beckett could decide right now whether the rest of his life happened with the law or against it. But the medals were not a thing that was up for discussion. He never raised his voice. He didn't have to. Lyle Beckett looked at the deputy, and the neighbor, and the old woman, and the dog, and the certainty drained out of his smooth face the way it drains out of a man who has finally been seen for exactly what he is. The medals were in the truck. He gave them back with a hand that was not quite steady, and the dog watched him all the way down the drive and did not relax until the clean truck was gone. What happened over the following weeks moved through that little county the slow, certain way the truth moves in country places, in the feed store and the church social and the diner on the square. Deputy Boyd's questions turned up a string of others. Beckett had worked the same way. Frightened old folks who had been too ashamed to report it. And one by one they came forward now that someone had gone first, and the smiling man's whole enterprise came apart in the daylight. Opal Greer's money was a harder thing to get back. But the church and the county veterans post, when they heard the story, a Korea Marine's widow robbed of his medals, did the things such communities do. And the little white house on the lane got a new roof that summer raised by men who would not take a dime for it. And the work was real this time. The veterans post did one thing more. On a Sunday in the early fall, they gathered in Opal's yard, a few dozen of them, old and young, and they pinned Frank Greer's recovered Bronze Star and Purple Heart to a board beside his photograph and his folded flag, and they stood in the heat and said his name out loud, the name of a rifleman who had held a frozen ridge 70 years before and come home and been loved by one good woman and never quite believed any of it. And Opal stood between Wyatt and the dog and let herself at last be proud out loud for the both of them. There are turns in a life that feel less like coincidence than like arrangement. That of all the doors on all the county roads, a starving Marine had knocked on the one belonging to a woman who had spent 50 years learning how to save a man exactly like him. A person does not have to know the word for that to feel it settle in the chest. And Wyatt Boone did not move on. The road had run out, and he found, to his own quiet astonishment, that he did not want to get back on it. He fixed the rest of what was broken in Opal Greer's house, and then in the houses of half her friends. And word got around that there was a Marine on the Greer place who did honest work and didn't overcharge an old woman. And somewhere in the middle of being useful again, of being trusted again, of being called by his name and by the word he had stopped letting himself use, Wyatt Boone started to come back from wherever he had gone. Opal gave him Frank's old workshop for good, and his daughter, when he finally found the courage to call her from a number that stayed the same for once, heard something in his voice she had not heard in years, and said maybe she'd come for a visit. On most evenings now, there are two on the porch of the little white house when the heat finally breaks and the cicadas start up. An old widow and a Marine who found his way home, and a German shepherd asleep in the doorway with his ribs filled back out in a place where the light gets left on. There is one more thing, Opal said to him, near the end of that summer, on the porch in the cool of the evening, and it was the thing she had never gotten to say to Frank. She told Wyatt that he had made it home, not that he was home, but that he had made it, that the long walk was over, that the man who had wandered out of his own life had survived it, that he was allowed at last to set the pack down and believe he had gotten back. And a Marine who had spent 3 years certain he was nobody and nowhere finally let himself believe an old woman who had earned across 50 hard years the right to say it. What changed Wyatt Boone's life was not extraordinary in the way we usually mean the word. It was 4 whispered words through a screen door and a plate of food and an old woman who refused to be afraid of a broken man because she had loved one all her life and knew that what looks like danger on a porch is very often just a soul that has run out of road. She opened the door wider. That was all it took. That was everything it took. This story is for everyone who has run all the way to the end of their road, and for everyone who has ever opened a door they had every reason to keep shut. Has a stranger ever shown you a kindness you have never been able to forget? Or have you ever been the one who opened the door? Put it in the comments below. Let's fill this section with the doors that got open and leave it there for people to find when they need it. Every story on this channel is about the grace that shows up at the end of the road in the people the world tells us to be afraid of. If that means something to you, subscribe so you're here for the next one. There are more of these stories to tell. And before you go, which moment in this one stayed with you the most? I'll see you in the comments.